The National Museum of the American Indian advertises itself as one museum with two locations, one in DC and one in New York. From the moment I entered the New York branch, the similarities in its interpretive approach were apparent. The exhibit Native New York was incredibly similar to the DC exhibit Nation to Nation. Both tell a two-sided story of first contact between the Americans and the Europeans, debunking common misconceptions and exploring the problems with those misconceptions. Yet there was one big difference between the two exhibits. The National Museum of the American Indian in DC focused on a national story, but the National Museum of the American Indian in New York focused on New York. Two locations, one acting a lot more like a state museum than a national one. Neither approach is wrong, but the differences in these approaches reveal something about how we think about the two cities. It's easy to think of New York as being a place with a history from before it was New York. Most places have been something before they're the place they are now. This imagining gets easier when we incorporate the myth of the natives selling Manhattan for a bag of beads. Obviously, we think, there had to have been someone here before, so go on, tell me, what's their story? DC also has stories to tell, both of the people who live here now and the people of the four Algonquin tribes who lived here before. When you pause for a moment to think about that, of course people lived here before DC existed. It has two navigable, fishable rivers, the land is swampy and fertile, there are trees for construction, game to hunt, and hospitable weather. So why doesn't the DC Museum tell these stories like the New York Museum tells the New York story? In popular consciousness, DC isn't so much a geographical location with nearly 700,000 residents as it is a holding space. You may have learned in school, like I did, that it's important to have a capital in a federal district rather than in a state because otherwise, the capital could give preferential treatment to whichever state it happened to be in. As if Northern Virginia and Southern Maryland haven't benefited massively from lucrative government contracts. At least partially because of this political model, we tend to think of DC less as a place and more as a holding space where government representatives can congress, in which the only business worth discussing is the federal government. This marginal conception of DC is in part to blame for popular resistance to DC statehood. Why should a few people on a territory 1/28th the size of Rhode Island get to be a whole state? Doesn't make any sense. Well, according to our laws, you only need 60,000 people to be a state, so it has enough people 11 times over. The other reason is that the residents of DC are overwhelmingly Black Democrats, so turning DC into a state might tip the balance of our two-party system, the maintenance of which is, of course, more important than ensuring congressional representation for all citizens. This way of thinking doesn't just influence our modern politics, it also influences our ability to imagine the past. If we imagine DC as some amalgam of American representative democracy, then we don't view it as an organic place with a legacy in its own right, and we forget to tell these stories. Most of the Smithsonian museums give a brief nod to DC. This isn't to their detriment necessarily, but it is noteworthy, especially since the New York location of the American Indian Museum was so New York focused. I say most because there is one Smithsonian museum that's exclusively focused on DC history, and that's the Anacostia Community Museum. Before it was brought into the Smithsonian Institution, it was a local museum telling nearby history. This museum just jumped up to the top of my to-visit list.